They said a bus driver got dropped just for rocking red in the wrong block, and that one story still echoes through the streets of South Los Angeles. Folks talk about over 20 bodies stacking up in recent years, but the roots of that war stretch back decades before those headlines. Two hoods locked in a beef, living back to back with only 120th Street separating them. This isn't a Hollywood scene or a scripted movie. This is real pavement stained in South Central. And the story goes deeper than colors, deeper than headlines, and deeper than what most outsiders ever understood. Los Angeles in the early 1970s was a city where the streets were already starting to shape whole generations of young men. The Athens Park Bloods formed around 1972, coming straight out of the Athens neighborhood, an unincorporated part of South Los Angeles where young black kids built an identity out of survival and loyalty. Athens Park became their anchor, the name carried by their set. And by the mid-70s, they were repping the blood alliance that had begun to grow in response to the rising Crip movement. The East Coast Crips came up around the same time on the east side of South Central, spreading out through multiple blocks with different numbers attached to each set. The 118 East Coast Block Crips locked down their section around 118th Street, and from the jump, they were in direct opposition to the Athens Park Bloods. The split wasn't just about colors, it was about lines drawn in a city where the wrong street could be a death sentence. Geography made this beef nearly impossible to avoid. Broadway Manchester ran close to Green Meadows, and Athens Park, Blood's turf, pressed right up against 118 East Coast Crip territory. The border ran along 120th Street, a line that looked simple on a map but turned into a front line in real life. Every walk home, every trip to the store, every hangout on the block could turn into a confrontation, and by the end of the 1970s, everybody in those neighborhoods already knew which way the wind was blowing. Older heads from both sides remember the early clashes, stories of drive-bys and walk-ups that didn't make the papers but carried weight on the block. The Athens Park Bloods built their identity around their section of the park and the surrounding blocks, while the 118 East Coast Crips grew stronger as part of the wider East Coast car, rolling with other East Coast sets across the city. Even then, that proximity made things different here, because both sides were forced to look each other in the eyes almost every single day. The late 70s and early 80s in Los Angeles saw violence spreading through neighborhoods, and the beef between Athens and 118 didn't stay quiet. These weren't the kinds of wars that caught national attention like the ones tied to bigger Crip or blood sets, but the people living in those neighborhoods knew the score. In Athens, young men grew up learning to watch their backs whenever they crossed Avalon Boulevard or San Pedro, because slipping into the wrong corner could be fatal. By the early 1980s, crack cocaine and the rise of gun violence put more pressure on these neighborhoods, and both the Athens Park Bloods and the 118 East Coast Block Crips were pulled deeper into the cycle. Shootings and retaliations became part of everyday life, with bodies dropping but few stories making headlines. LAPD reports from that era show spikes in violent crime across South Los Angeles, but very few of those cases were ever cleared. That left families grieving and sets plotting their next move. The mid-80s only made things hotter. Inglewood, Compton, and South Central all saw record murder rates, and Athens Park wasn't spared. Homicides climbed across Los Angeles County, and Bloods and Crips beefs made certain neighborhoods no-go zones for outsiders. Athens Park Bloods and 118 ECC carved their names into that history through constant skirmishes that sometimes only lasted seconds, but left permanent scars. For every young man who got dropped, another one stepped up ready to rep his set. During the late 80s and into the 90s, Athens Park Bloods started to make more noise in the streets, while the East Coast Crips continued to expand their influence. Documentaries like those made by CLE Bone Sloan, who came up out of Athens Park, even referenced how long the beef had been alive. For folks on the inside, this was nothing new. They had been living with that tension since the early days, and by the time the 1990s came around, the line at 120th Street was already written in blood. The 1990s brought more exposure to Los Angeles gang culture through movies, music, and news reports, but the Athens versus 118 feud never got the spotlight like bigger conflicts. That didn't mean it wasn't deadly. Locals recall constant back and forth shootings, families moving away when they could, and kids learning to check colors before stepping outside. For Athens Park and 118 ECC members, it was personal history, and even though the rest of the world barely noticed, the war kept burning year after year. By the end of the 1990s, both sets had stacked their reputations through decades of fights, shootings, and revenge. The rivalry had survived law enforcement sweeps, the rise and fall of truce attempts, and the constant churn of young men jumping in to replace those lost. While the newspapers might have been focused on larger gang crackdowns in the neighborhoods around Athens Park and 118th Street, the beef remained steady. It was a war being fought right under everyone's noses, waiting to erupt into the kind of bloodshed that would finally put it on the map. By the time the calendar flipped into the 2000s, Athens Park Bloods and the 118 East Coast Crips had already lived through decades of gun smoke and tension. The geography had never changed, and the bodies that dropped through the mid-80s and 1990s set the foundation for what was about to come in the new century. Law enforcement pushed hard on South Los Angeles during this time, with the Athens Park Bloods specifically targeted in Operation Blood Clout in 2009. That sweep grabbed about 20 members from the set, with guns and narcotics pulled straight from their neighborhood. The papers reported that it was a big win for law enforcement, but people in Athens knew it didn't shut anything down. The street still had young homies looking for retaliation and recognition, and the feud with 118 stayed alive even with members locked up. Hood days carried major weight in this period, and they often turned into the spark for violence. Each set had their own days that mattered, tied to founding dates or numeric ties to their block. These celebrations were meant to bring people together to remember fallen homies and show unity, but the gatherings also put big targets on their backs. The bigger the crowd, the bigger the chance somebody from the opposition decided to pull up and test it. Police presence around Hood days became routine, but it rarely stopped the shots from ringing out. Athens Park Bloods knew that July 11th was a day when eyes were on them, while the 118 East Coast Crips held January 18th close. Those days meant music, barbecues, and big block gatherings, but they also meant every rival had the date circled, waiting for movement. Youngsters and older members both knew that pulling up on a rival Hood day was considered a strong statement, and more than one Hood day ended with bodies on the ground. Throughout the early 2000s, stories of Hood day shootings kept stacking up, and they became part of the war's rhythm. People in South Central spoke about those dates like they were cursed because too many times they ended with tape on the pavement. In Athens Park territory, apartments near Jarvis and San Pedro saw police lights flash after Hood day violence, while across 120th Street, 118 block corners carried their own memorial candles after Hood day drive-bys. One case that showed the pattern came in 2003, when an Athens Park Bloods Hood day turned bloody after suspected East Coast affiliates slid through late evening. Reports from locals said the party was ending when the shots came, leaving 2 young men injured and 1 dead before sirens pulled up. Stories like that didn't get national coverage, but everyone in the section remembered who was lost that night. That memory carried into future Hood days, keeping the cycle of revenge alive. By the end of the decade, the Athens Park Bloods and the 118 East Coast Crips had created a rhythm that revolved around these violent anniversaries. Operation Blood Clout might have hit hard in 2009, but the bullets flying on Hood days proved that the feud wasn't slowing down. Every Hood day came with celebration, but it also carried the shadow of potential retaliation, and that shadow followed them into the next decade, where things only got more violent. By 2017, Athens Park Bloods and 118 East Coast Crips had already lived decades of back and forth shootings, but one incident that year proved how dangerous this feud was for civilians. It started with a young man named Key Poppy Grant, an Athens Park affiliate who was only 23 at the time. On April 23, 2017, Poppy was walking in broad daylight when a car rolled up near him. According to court testimony, the men inside asked his affiliation before one of them opened fire, shooting Poppy in the back. He survived the attack, but the hit set off an immediate call for retaliation from the Athens side. Phone records later showed that Daniel Hill, an Athens Park Bloods member, texted someone that night saying his little cousin Poppy got hit and he was going to Athens Park. That message wasn't just casual. It was a sign that revenge was about to move into action. Hours after Poppy was shot, 3 Athens Park members, Ricardo Mumbles Mixon, Dashun Armstead, and Daniel Hill, decided to roll out armed and looking for payback. They didn't wait for planning or confirmation of the shooters. They simply moved on instinct, carrying assault rifles and pistols into East Coast territory. The 3 men drove into the 118 East Coast Crips section near Avalon Boulevard and 116th Street. It was late at night when they spotted 2 people standing near a townhouse driveway. Those 2 were cousins, 23-year-old Aaron Roseborough and 23-year-old Sha'Carri Kiki Chambers, who had just parked their car. Neither was gang affiliated, and their families later testified they were focused on music and poetry, not the streets. But that didn't matter when Athens members saw them. What sealed their fate was Aaron wearing a New York Yankees cap, a piece of clothing widely recognized in Los Angeles as a symbol tied to neighborhood Crips. To Ricardo Mixon and Dashun Armstead, the hat and the location were enough. They jumped out of the car with their weapons drawn and opened fire. Dozens of rounds tore through the driveway. Aaron was hit 5 times, while Kiki Chambers was hit 4 times. Armstead's pistol jammed at one point, but not before he fired into the home itself, spraying bullets into the living room where Aaron's parents were. The sound was described later by neighbors as cannon fire echoing through the block. Inside that house, family members hit the floor as bullets ripped past them. Outside, the tragedy played out in seconds. Aaron collapsed on the driveway, bleeding heavily. His father, Ron Roseborough, rushed outside after hearing the shots. He later recalled hearing his son gasping for breath, whispering, "Help me, I can't breathe." He tried to stop the bleeding with his own hands, but the wounds were too severe. Kiki was already lifeless nearby. By the time paramedics arrived, Chambers was pronounced dead at the scene, and Aaron died shortly after at the hospital. Both were only 23 years old. 2 young black lives ended in a feud they weren't even part of. The family spoke to the press in disbelief. Kiki's mother, Pamela Chambers, described her daughter as someone who wrote poetry and cared about her family. Aaron's mother, Bonnie, shook her head and called the murders senseless. Ron Roseborough told reporters, "You can't just kill innocent people," words that echoed across the community. To them, it wasn't gang warfare. It was murder of promising kids who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. The LAPD Criminal Gang Homicide Division took over the case, and detectives quickly suspected Athens Park members. Surveillance cameras in the area captured a car matching the suspect's vehicle circling before the murders. Phone records tied Daniel Hill's text to the events, showing his mindset right after Poppy was shot. Further investigation brought in witnesses and cell tower data, placing the trio near the scene. Detectives said the evidence stacked too neatly to ignore. The trial became one of the most high-profile cases tied to Athens Park in years. In court, prosecutors laid out the sequence. Poppy Grant shot earlier in the day, Daniel Hill sending the revenge text, Mixon and Armstead jumping out with rifles and pistols, and 2 innocent cousins gunned down. The Yankees hat became a symbol in the trial, showing how simple clothing could cost a life in South Los Angeles gang culture. Jurors heard recordings of the gunfire, saw photos of the scene, and listened to the devastated families testify. When the verdict came, it was decisive. Ricardo Mumbles Mixon and Dashun Armstead were convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to 70 years to life, plus 2 life without parole terms each. Daniel Hill, who drove the car and played a direct role, received 50 years to life plus 2 life without parole terms. These sentences ensured none of the 3 men would walk free again. The courtroom might have felt like justice to some, but it did not erase the loss for the Roseborough and Chambers families. This case left a deep scar on South Los Angeles because it showed that the war between Athens Park Bloods and 118 East Coast Crips wasn't just taking out rival members. Innocent lives were being swept up and ended over symbols and suspicion. The shooting of Aaron and Kiki became a reminder that civilians could be targeted, intentionally or not, whenever revenge was on the table. And for many people in Athens Park and East Coast neighborhoods, the fear only grew after 2017 because the streets had already proven that anyone could get caught in the crossfire when the cycle of retaliation moved forward. By the time 2020 came around, South Los Angeles was already heavy with tension, but the Athens Park Bloods and the 118 East Coast Crips pushed it to another level. Police trackers and street reports counted at least 12 murders tied directly to the feud that year. The killings didn't come in a single burst either. They came spread throughout months, leaving families and neighborhoods on edge every week. One shooting that year shook the community because of who got hit. A group of older men was riding motorcycles home from church service when gunmen came through. Nobody expected respected older men to be touched in this war, but the shooters opened fire without hesitation. 2 men were killed right there on the street, and the community couldn't even explain the motive beyond reckless gang retaliation. The incident showed how random the violence had grown, because even elders and churchgoers weren't safe. Another case that stuck with locals was the killing of 25-year-old Camilo Kimo Boyet in December 2020. He was shot near 140 East 120th Street, right on the border between Athens Park and East Coast territory. Reports say he was connected to East Coast, but some friends later claimed he didn't gangbang. Whether he was active or not, the gunfire left him dead, and his family mourned a man they described as peaceful. His killing symbolized the way people could still get targeted just for their presence in contested ground. Athens Park members were suspected in several retaliation murders throughout the year. After any attack on their side, someone else ended up shot days or weeks later on the East Coast side. Those patterns became obvious to people living in the area, even when the cases stayed officially unsolved. LAPD cleared only a handful of the killings in 2020, leaving most of them cold on paper. But everyone in the streets knew the feud explained almost all of them. The constant cycle drew in more than just Athens Park and 118 East Coast. Allies started pulling up to back their side in the beef. Raymond Avenue Crips were said to roll with East Coast on some moves, while West Side Pyru and Harlem Crips aligned differently depending on the hit. A few Compton hoods even got dragged into the war. Locals later said the conflict pulled in 3 or 4 other hoods, making South Los Angeles feel like one big battlefield. The style of the shootings in 2020 also revealed the firepower both sides carried by then. Residents described almost every shootout as Chopper City, a slang way of saying automatic rifles sprayed whole blocks with rounds. High-powered rifles and extended magazines became the norm, and that meant multiple victims every time a trigger got pulled. Families in South Los Angeles described ducking behind cars and fences whenever bullets started flying because the shooters didn't care who else was nearby. The body count told the story of that year. 12 homicides officially linked to the Athens and East Coast feud, most left unsolved by investigators, and none bringing real peace. Every murder left someone plotting revenge, every loss demanded a response, and the streets stayed ready for the next scrimmage. For people living on those blocks, 2020 felt like a war zone, with bullets flying often enough that nobody could feel safe even inside their own home. One of the wildest stories tied to the Athens Park and East Coast feud is about a bus driver who got killed just for wearing red. The details around the case stayed cloudy, but locals kept saying the man was spotted in the wrong section wearing a red garment. In Crip territory, that one choice of color turned into a death sentence, and that story spread across South Los Angeles as a warning. The killing of the bus driver wasn't even unique when you looked at other cases from the city. In 2015, a 19-year-old named Tavin Price was confronted at a car wash in South Los Angeles. 2 Crip members pressed him about his red shoes and red shirt, and when he didn't remove them, they shot him 4 times. Price wasn't banging and had developmental disabilities, but his red clothes were enough to make him a target. That murder was covered heavy in the news, and the district attorney even said he was killed simply because of the colors he wore. Stories like that explain why families in neighborhoods like Athens Park, Broadway Manchester, and Green Meadows taught their kids to avoid certain colors. Mothers told their sons not to wear red in East Coast blocks, while fathers warned them about blue when walking through Athens Park. Some parents drove their kids to school every day because they didn't want them waiting for buses in dangerous colors. The fear wasn't exaggerated because even adults like the bus driver had paid the price. It went beyond just red or blue clothing. Certain hats carried meaning too, like New York Yankees fitteds connected with neighborhood Crips, or certain college logos that got tied to sets. Wearing those symbols in the wrong block could bring questions you didn't want to answer. Police reports and community notes showed multiple cases where the first thing a victim got asked was, "Where you from?" followed immediately by a check on their colors. For civilians who didn't claim any gang, that question could still end their life. The psychology of living under those rules cut deep for the residents. Kids grew up scared to put on the wrong cap, scared to buy the wrong sneakers, scared to walk with friends if their colors didn't match. People who didn't bang described it like living in a cage where every choice of clothing could be judged. Folks would talk about walking each other to cars at night just because they knew how quickly things could go left if they stood alone with the wrong look. For people outside Los Angeles, it can sound unreal that colors could mean death. But in Athens Park and East Coast turf, perception was everything. A red hat in the wrong place was a reason to shoot, and a blue shirt on the wrong block could get somebody pressed. The bus driver story stuck with people because it reminded everyone that even working men could end up victims of a war that never gave passes. The rules of colors created an atmosphere where every single choice carried risk, and residents lived daily with the fear that one wrong step could be their last. When 2021 came, the violence didn't slow down. It only piled on top of what the community already suffered. Reports linked at least 11 murders to the Athens Park Bloods and the 118 East Coast Crips feud that year alone. These weren't scattered across the city. They were concentrated around South Los Angeles, Compton, and parts of unincorporated county blocks that connected to the rivalry. For people living in those neighborhoods, it felt like the war was expanding outward, pulling more streets into the conflict. Many of the killings stayed officially unsolved, which only kept the cycle alive. Detectives could connect incidents by the weapons used or the patterns of timing, but without cooperation, cases never made it far in court. Families buried loved ones and waited for justice, but the reality of the street code made that unlikely. Witnesses stayed quiet, neighbors avoided police interviews, and even victims' friends rarely spoke on what they knew. Everyone understood that talking could get them targeted next, so silence became the only option. One example that stuck out happened when two motorcycle riders were shot down while cruising through South Los Angeles. The men were older, not known to bang, and they were coming home after visiting friends. Gunmen sprayed bullets into them while they rode, leaving both dead on the pavement. No witnesses stepped forward with real testimony, and the shooters vanished back into the maze of South Central blocks. The case showed how even non-gang members got caught in the storm whenever retaliation rolled forward. The feud also stretched deeper into Compton and county areas during this period. Reports placed Athens Park affiliates in shootings near Willowbrook and Rosecrans, while East Coast members were said to be active on the East County side. People from Watts, Westside, Piru, and other nearby neighborhoods whispered about the beef, dragging more outsiders into the mix. The alliances that started showing up in 2020 continued, and every shooting seemed to risk pulling in another set ready to stand with one side or the other. Law enforcement expressed frustration publicly, saying they knew who was involved in many of the killings, but lacked evidence strong enough to secure convictions. Detectives blamed the lack of cooperation, while locals said police never offered real protection for people who talked. This left a deadlock where shootings kept happening, families kept losing sons and daughters, and the legal system stayed stuck. The silence wasn't confusion, it was survival, because the code of the street demanded no cooperation with the police. By the time 2022 rolled around, Athens Park and East Coast still carried heavy scars from the back and forth. Several more killings were tied to the feud, keeping the number of lives lost climbing. Innocents, relatives, and associates all faced the risk of being pulled into the mix, whether they claimed a hood or not. The streets of South Los Angeles had become a place where every loss felt temporary, because everyone expected another retaliation waiting just around the corner. On November 8th, 2023, South Los Angeles woke up to another killing tied to the Athens Park and East Coast feud, but this one hit especially hard. A 17-year-old known as Hellboy, who was affiliated with the 118 East Coast Crips, was gunned down in a car-to-car shooting. The attack happened in broad daylight, right on the streets of South Central, with witnesses describing a spray of automatic fire tearing through his vehicle. The date made the murder carry even more meaning because November 8th lined up with 11/8, a symbolic day for the 118 East Coast Crips set. That connection wasn't missed by anyone in the neighborhood, and many people immediately saw the killing as more than coincidence. For East Coast members, it looked like a deliberate hit meant to send a message, and for Athens Park affiliates, rumors on social media suggested it was planned as payback for earlier shootings. Hellboy's age drew the most shock from the community. At only 17 years old, he had barely started his life, yet he was already tied to a gang feud that dated back decades before his birth. Residents described it as a sign of how young the cycle had reached, with kids pulled in before even finishing high school. Candlelight vigils popped up quickly, with friends and family painting murals and posting tributes online. Hashtags spread through Instagram and Twitter, showing his face and pointing fingers across the line at Athens Park. The LAPD confirmed the car-to-car nature of the shooting, but didn't release immediate suspects, leaving the street to fill in the blanks. Online chatter pointed directly at Athens Park members as the ones behind it, calling the move retaliation wrapped in symbolism. The story traveled quickly because of the numbers tied to the date, making it another example of how even calendar days carried dangerous meanings in South Los Angeles gang culture. For people living in the area, Hellboy's murder wasn't just another body. It was proof that teenagers were not shielded from the feud. The blood spilled that day added to the body count already stacked between Athens Park and East Coast, and it reminded everyone that the war continued without pause. The symbolic hit on 11/8 showed how far members would go to make a statement, even if it meant killing a 17-year-old in broad daylight. The feud between Athens Park Bloods and 118 East Coast Crips left entire neighborhoods living under constant fear, with families and kids forced to adapt their lives around violence. Multi-generational membership kept the war alive, with sons following fathers into the sets, and each new loss only deepening the cycle. Residents spoke about ducking gunfire, planning routes to avoid certain streets, and never letting children wear colors that could mark them as targets. Social media also added fuel, with music videos, tribute posts, and online disrespect making small sparks turn into deadly confrontations. Community activists tried to broker peace, holding meetings and urging truces, but distrust between sets and distrust of law enforcement blocked progress. Police patrols on hood days were heavy, yet people still expected shootings to happen. Families of victims called for justice but rarely saw closure because silence on the streets kept cases cold. The murder of rapper August 08 in 2023, reportedly tied to something as small as a red hat, showed again how fragile life was under these rules. For South Los Angeles, the war felt endless, with 120th Street remembered as a line written in blood and loss.